Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Your attention, please. We're going to get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Club of Portland. I'm Pete Heuser, your president. Well, we're done with our debate season, so I don't expect any third-party candidates to be jumping up on the stage today and pushing their way to the mic. Instead, we have Robin Karr-Morse, who's a columnist and co-author of the book Ghosts from the Nursery, Tracing the Roots of Violence. Just have a couple of announcements. Next week on November 6th, we'll have our post-election analysis, this time with panelists from other parts of the state. They'll be talking about the results of the election from the perspective of citizens in their areas. That'll be at the Doubletree Hotel at Lloyd Center. Now, our Education Issue Committee has completed an innovative election cycle project. They sent a series of 3 questions on the subject of education to all candidates running for office. They received responses from 33 different candidates and have written them up and have made them available to members on the club's website. The website, I believe, is www.pdxcityclub.org. Is that right? I guess it is. Now, at the Growth Management Issue Committee's November 5th meeting, the Portland Development Commission will provide an overview of PDC's redevelopment projects east of Southeast 39th Street. And they'll discuss the role that PDC can play in assisting neighborhoods to implement regional planning goals. All members are welcome to that meeting. That's at noon at the Northwest Natural Building on November 5th. Our board host today is Lloyd Anderson. Lloyd is president-elect of the club, and he'll ask the first question of our speaker. After Lloyd's question, of course, we'll open it up for City Club members in the audience to ask their questions. Our corporate sponsors today are the law firm of Lane Powell Spears Leversky, Weyerhaeuser Corporation, and CH2M Hill. We continue to be very grateful for their support. Now on to our program. We're all aware of the headlines in Oregon and elsewhere about how younger and younger children are committing serious violent crimes. We hear that adults who have shot police or have beaten victims have been violent or at least very unusual from very young ages. Robin Karr-Morse came out with her book this summer, shortly before the Springfield school shootings. Since that time, her advice has been even more highly sought after than before. She's met in the White House with the President and Mrs. Clinton and Janet Reno to discuss this issue and is going to be returning there in a couple of weeks. She's attempting to try to get people to focus on the significance of early child development. And when she talks about early, she doesn't mean 5 or even 3 years old. She's talking about infancy and is looking closely at prenatal periods. Robin has been active in educating parents and families in Oregon for over 20 years. She was the director of parent training with the Children's Services Division in Oregon and was the first director of the Children's Trust Fund, designed to help abused children. Robin has an active family therapy practice in Portland, and her background as a step-parent, former foster parent, and adoptive parent. She's had those personal involvements in some of the most challenging family relationships that we know of. Now let's welcome Robin Karr-Morse to the City Club.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, to which I only want to add one fact, and that is that I'm also a biological parent, and one of my children, my third child, is sitting here among us today, so I don't want to denigrate the importance of being just a regular old parent. The hardest job anybody ever has, right? Since Ghosts from the Nursery was published in late January 1998, I've spent almost as much time, as Pete said earlier, traveling and talking about this topic as I have being at home seeing clients in my private practice. Until this spring, Oregon seemed to most people when I traveled, particularly in the East and the Midwest, like a sleepy little mecca of environmentally conscious folks, a place where a lot of people thought to go to get away from it all. Jonesboro seemed a long way away. And then, as all of you in this room know, Jonesboro came to Oregon, landing in rural Springfield, when a boy named Kip Kinkle shot first his parents and then opened fire on a group of his classmates at Thurston High School. Interviewers have asked me each week since what I know about Kip Kinkle, and I tell them essentially only what's on the internet, that this child was depressed and had been consumed by rage for a long time, that he was on Prozac and had a history of killing small animals, that he wasn't poor, that he's white, that he had two parents who were teachers. Recently now, we've begun to hear a little more about the earliest childhood of this boy, that he was a challenge for his parents even as a toddler. In a few moments, we're going to discuss several qualities this boy clearly did not have. It will be many months, maybe years, before we know why. But this is the question everyone wants to know. What's going on when a high school freshman suddenly murders his parents and then opens fire on his classmates? Or when two rural boys from Arkansas plan and then systematically stage a horrific fire drill to gun down other children? What's going on when a 6-year-old leads 8-year-old twins to a sleeping baby? This was actually the Bermuda story in California, where these 3 little boys went in search of a tricycle at a neighboring apartment, found a 1-month-old baby sleeping in his bassinet, dumped that baby out of the bassinet, and beat and kicked that child almost to death. It was a particularly memorable story. Many of you may remember the father of the baby on television, because he came on pleading for mercy, to be shown with these 3 little ones. He understood all too well the circumstances that had gone into the making of these children, and though it was his baby that was victimized, he pled for people to understand the kinds of factors these children lived with. In the last 6 months, especially following the school shootings, there have been many discussions around Oregon in the media about the root causes of this problem. Topping the list of causes attributed are typically access to guns, copycat crimes, media violence, and the lack of programs for kids after school. In some discussions, you'll hear people attributing poverty and even geography. While each of these factors may play a role, the fact is that even all of these factors taken together, media violence, poverty, geography, and the lack of programs, don't explain how or why. How can kids plan and then systematically kill their classmates? How, in the course of a half dozen or even a dozen years, can a baby metamorphosize into a violent killer, and why? What I want to do today is to help lift the veil on these questions on how violence can become rooted in very young children. We're going to look at the brain-based common denominators that link many of the children that we've read about in the news, and we're going to then examine the qualities that we can build in to mitigate against violence in young children. Finally, we're going to take a look at what we must do as a community to stem the tide of violent behavior in which we're all immersed. Over the last 5 years, the crime rate in this country has dropped across the U.S., and well, it should have. Since 1980, we have more than tripled our prison space in this country. Next to Russia, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. 1 in 3 homes being built in this country is being built behind bars. As of 1995, more than 5 million Americans were living under the control of the criminal justice system, as compared with 6 million students enrolled in colleges and universities nationwide. If this trend continues, we'll soon have more people in prison than in higher education. This is already the case in the state of California, which spends quite a bit more money on criminal justice than on higher ed. According to recent data released by the FBI at our present rate of incarceration, 1 in 20 babies being born in this community and communities all across the nation, 1 in 20 born today will spend some part of their lives in jail or prison. And we still can't feel safe on our streets at night or even in our schools. Although the crime rate is dropping, including juvenile crime, still the fastest growing segment of the criminal population in this country are children. Last year, nearly 1 million children under the age of 15 were arrested for felonies. As the ages of violent offenders drop and the brutality of their crimes increase, judges, police, social service workers across the country are struggling with how to cope with violent children who are too young to shave and in some cases too young to tie their own shoes. Our chief strategies for coping with this problem combine trying desperately to provide programs for out-of-control pre-adolescents and adolescents with new police models, getting tough on crime, harsher sentencing, trying kids as adults, longer time actually served, and of course, building more prisons. Well, neither I nor I'm sure any of you in this room dispute our need as a society to protect ourselves. There's a bankruptcy to our current approaches to this problem in this country. As the faces of violent offenders grow younger and the lines between perpetrators and victims become increasingly blurred, we simply have to think about where this problem is coming from. Exactly how do we effectively remediate, let alone get tough, on a kid like this one? This is Ray DeFord from Aloha. Most of you will remember this child last year who set fire to his apartment building, killing 8 people and sending 15 others to the hospital. My understanding is that Ray has a permanent cleft in his cranium where his father hit him with a clipboard for crying as a very little boy. This was the same father who weaned Ray at 18 months of age by putting his baby bottle in a pan of rubbing alcohol and setting it on fire in front of him. Ray's mother is retarded, and this child was left to fend for himself since he was tiny. Will Ray become a child who's remorseful or who even comprehends what he's done? Probably not. Will he become capable of complex thinking, which would allow him insight into his own and other people's motivations? Probably not. Will he develop the ability to formulate constructive alternatives to impulsive behavior? Maybe. However, generalizing those to future situations may be extremely difficult for Ray and for children like him, given a history of emotional and learning disabilities. Where do we go with children like this? Certainly, we don't give up on them. That's what I do for a living. It's what many of you in this room may do for a living, is to work with children like this. But the costs to society are enormous. You already know that the therapies are expensive, they're seldom funded for adequate duration and intensity, and the reality is that many, if not most, children who finally do get this kind of intervention don't receive them in time to turn around their sense of themselves as marked or as troubled. We certainly need more programs for children at later stages of problems. We need more CASAs, we need more mental health workers, we need more child welfare workers. But we also need to stem the tide of children who are predictably requiring these programs. Our current strategy is to wait for full-blown symptoms to emerge before intervening. Then our prevailing get tough attitude of voters focuses money and policies on prisons rather than treatment. This is a diagram that I did for the children's care team now almost 5 years ago. On the left-hand side, you'll see age 0, and on the right, you'll see age 18. As you move from left to right, the cost and intensity of treatment efforts to reverse the problem increases, and conversely, the possibility, the likelihood of preserving that child's original potential to contribute to society decreases. You can see that as you move from left to right, the color intensifies. On the far right-hand side of this little chart are the words adult criminal justice system. If we look at the people currently in jail or prisons and trace the cycle backwards, you'll see that most of the people now in prison, not all, but most, somewhere in the 60th percentile, were arrested as adolescents. In high school, these kids were likely to have been involved in alcohol, in drugs, often gangs. Typically, they weren't doing well in school. They were truant, often delinquent, sometimes runaway or pregnant. People knew they were in trouble. I'm moving now from right to left on this little diagram, starting with the adult criminal justice system, moving back to high school. If we look earlier, now closer toward the middle of this chart, most of these troubled adolescents were known at grade school as children who had learning, behavioral, or emotional problems. A frightening number of these kids have physical handicaps, were delayed, or had developmental disabilities. If we look back still earlier to the neighborhood, a high percentage of these children were children known to be left alone, without adequate supervision, they were inadequately fed. There were children with parents often too absorbed in drugs, in mental illness, in the criminal justice system, in extreme poverty, to adequately parent their children. Many of these children were neglected or abused, and the neighbors knew. They just didn't know what to do. Finally, if we look back to the beginning, these are often the babies born in hospitals today and every day across Portland and across the nation who go home with parents too overwhelmed to show the first sign of cherishing their babies. Some mothers are clearly depressed or have bruised faces or backs, or are teenagers without support and leave the hospital without a single visitor. Many of these mothers had no prenatal care. Some brought their babies into the world already hooked on the same drugs that she took to mask her own despair. Well, we clearly recognize the warning signs. Most of you know them well. Parental substance abuse, family violence, teenage parenthood, to name just a few of the most obvious. We wait. We wait for parents to fail. We wait for children to appear in the system. And by that time, for a growing number of children, it's too late. The educational system, the Child Protective Service system, the juvenile justice system, the prison system, and the welfare system are all stretched beyond capacity, and they can't fix the problems. We pay for children growing up damaged and angry. When we talk about crime, when we talk about bigger jails, when we talk about expanded police forces, more drug enforcement, we're talking about the same kids later. If our goal is to adequately understand the violent behavior in which America is now submerged, we must, with rare exceptions, look before adolescence, before grade school, before preschool, to the cradle of human formation in the first 33 months of life. These months, including the 9 months of gestation and the first 24 months after birth, harbor the seeds of impulsive violence for a growing number of American children. This is chapter 1, the missing chapter in the stories of most violent offenders in the news. Our thesis in Ghosts from the Nursery is that the roots of violence can begin in the womb and can be well entrenched by preschool. This is not to say that later events don't count. It's not to say that we give up. It's rather to say that what happens early, biologically and psychologically, creates either relative receptivity to or relative resistance to factors that may catalyze violence later in a child's life. Factors like the availability of guns or violent modeling on television are absorbed very differently by a little brain that is rageful and detached than by a brain that is connected and empathic with other people. The person who says this best is a colleague of ours at Baylor Medical College in Houston. His name is Dr. Bruce Perry. Perry says, it's not the finger that pulls the trigger, it's the brain. It's not the penis that rapes, it's the brain. Violence begins in the brain, and the brain begins in the womb. Violence, like all behavior, is brain-based. The rooting of violent responses or of responses that mitigate against violence begin when the brain begins in the womb. The roots of violence do not stem from a single source. This is not the story of nature versus nurture. Nature and nurture each play a part. What happens is that biological factors like prematurity, or the effects of drugs in utero, or birth trauma, or tiny brain hemorrhages, or ADD, or difficult temperaments can render a baby vulnerable. And then when these biological conditions affecting infants are then compounded by social factors affecting their families, factors like mental illness, domestic violence, drug abuse, immaturity, or criminal involvement, the results can be the toxic recipe for the abuse or neglect of that little brain at critical points in early development. Now, in the course of the next less than half hour, it's neither interesting nor possible to get extremely technical about the new brain research. So what I'm going to do is share with you just some very, very basic facts, the most essential ones about brain development as they apply to the violence equation. In writing the book, as Meredith and I combed through, we took 4 years to write the book, and we combed through literally stacks of articles of research on new research on the brain. The most amazing fact of all that emerged from the research is that the brain is a dynamic, interactive organ. Unlike any other organ in the body, say a heart or a kidney or a liver, each of which grows on a course that's primarily set by genetics, the brain is designed to actually complete itself, to complete its development, to actually build gray matter in response to the specific stimulation in a specific environment. Sensual input, sound, sight, touch, movement, all build gray matter, or not, in that little brain. When adequate stimulation is not forthcoming, as in the case of chronic neglect, or when these experiences are abnormal, as when a child is exposed to chronic trauma or abuse, the brain reflects these realities physically. This begins with the very first environment in the womb. During gestation, as a fetus develops, brain cells are originally formed in the center of the brain, an area called the ventricular region of the brain. They have to then migrate from this region in the center of the fetal brain up the cerebral wall to form the cortex, the outside layer of the brain that we use to think with. So these cells have to move from the center of the brain to the surface. To get there, these little cells, which you see as little dots on the slide, have to climb these rope-like fibers called glial fibers. Each cell has a very precise schedule and a precise destination. Picture 1 billion of these traveling through the fetal brain every day. As a cell climbs, it comes into contact with numerous other cells along the way. This contact activates genes in the neurons, in the basic brain cells, that define that cell's identity and mission. When all goes well, the cells proceed to their planned destination and perform their appointed tasks. But if anything interrupts or sidetracks this journey, the results can be disastrous. Introduced at the wrong time, sometimes just a very brief window on the wrong day, especially early in the pregnancy, often before we know we're pregnant. Substances like alcohol, cocaine, nicotine, even some prescribed drugs can alter the journey of the brain cells. If these tiny cells connect with cells they weren't meant to, the fetal brain can be forever affected. These differences may not be visible at birth. The baby may look normal. The difficulty may only become evident as the part of the brain that's been affected comes into play in that child's development. These tiny synaptic connections, not meant to happen, can cause autism, epilepsy, and schizophrenia. This microscopic disorganization in cell migration is also implicated in the upsurge in learning disabilities that we're now seeing, including attention deficits and hyperactivity. So from the beginning, the ways that our brains are formed reflect not only our genetics, but also our experiences. Then after birth, and for our first 2 years, the human brain continues to grow at fetal rates. We're unique. Man is unique in having this prolonged period of vulnerability. Other primates come into the world with brains much further along, much more complete in their development than does man. At birth, our brains weigh in at only 25% of their adult weight. The macaque monkey, which is the breed most widely studied in the brain research, is born with a brain weighing in at 60% of its adult weight. And even chimps, who are closest of all to us genetically, come in with brains weighing 45% of their adult weight. But the human brain, having begun at 25% of adult brain weight, by age 2 reaches 90% of adult brain weight. So this period of very rapid growth early in life puts huge importance on the stimulation surrounding the baby in this first 33-month period. Here's how this looks. Each brain cell contains an axon and several dendrites, which are these little hair-like particles that branch out at the top of this slide of a neuron. When the dendrite of one cell hooks up with the axon of another, a synapse is formed. A synapse is the basic way that brain cells communicate with each other. In the first years of life, each brain cell can form up to 15,000 synapses. Growing synaptic connections is the primary activity in the brain in the first 3 years. In fact, the newborn has as many synapses as the average adult, about 500 trillion. But by age 3, children have 1,000 trillion synaptic connections, almost double that of their pediatricians. In the next 7 years, the process of creating synapses is balanced almost equally by the process of eliminating unused synapses, a process called pruning. And then during adolescence, guess what the primary activity is? Those of us who have parented adolescent children could have told you this long before there were PET scans. During adolescence, the primary activity in the brain is the pruning of unused synaptic connections. So here's the bottom line. Those synapses that survive and those that don't are determined almost entirely by stimulation in the child's environment. Repeated stimulation increases the strength of the synapse so that synapses which are regularly stimulated can survive into adulthood, can survive into all of our lives. But synapses that are used, well, they become permanent. Synapses that are not used tend to be eliminated. Neglect early in life can have profound consequences. Like muscles elsewhere in the body, building brain tissue is a use it or lose it proposition. How well we think and how well we learn, both as children and adults, has everything to do with the quantity and quality of experiences at this time of life. Many of you may have seen a special program by Diane Sawyer done also about 1.5 years ago on 2020. What she did was show the work of a neuroscientist. His name is Harry Shigani. He's at Wayne State University. This man uses scans, PET scans, to show the brains of children during the course of a simple task. When children are asked to do these tasks, what happens is that on a PET scan, the area of their brain that's being tapped by the task lights up in these bright reds and yellows. This basically shows the metabolism of glucose in the brain, which is the basic physiological process that underlies thought. On this program, each a normal or a non-deprived little girl and a little Romanian girl, both 7 years old, were asked to repeat a number sequence, like 545. The brain of the normal child reflected bright colors in the area stimulated by the task. But when the Romanian child was asked to do the same task, we saw her look into the camera and stammer 5, 5, 1. The area of her brain that should have responded to the task showed no activity. Given several tries, she still couldn't get the 3-number sequence. "It's a black hole," said the voice over the program, as the viewers were shown the colorless shadow in this area of her brain that should have been in bright lights. Adopted before 2, this little girl could speak, but she couldn't remember simple information like the 3-number sequence. The brain cells once available to process that task were simply never stimulated and are now lost to this child permanently. The reality is this is not an indictment, by the way, of Romanian adoptions. Many of these children have done well, and the real issue is when they were sent to the orphanage and how long they were left there. When children can stick a knife into a puppy and lick an ice cream cone at the same time, or kick and beat a sleeping infant, they're reflecting what they've absorbed or not absorbed. With the possible exception of accidental head injury, the most likely explanation is that when this kind of a child was available for connecting deeply, trustingly, positively with a key adult, it simply didn't happen. This function of connection is thought to be housed here in the brain, just back behind the center between the eyes in an area called the orbitofrontal cortex. Having never been built within the parental or caretaking relationship, these connections can be lost to the larger world. This disconnectedness is not senseless. The causes are not unknowable. The fact is that these children, like all of our children, reflect what they've experienced. The brain is the physical reflection of experience. Here, very graphically, we reap what we sow. There is, by the way, a tendency to think, for most of us, to think of emotional neglect in the same category as physical neglect, as a byproduct of either poverty or of abuse. But emotional neglect is, in fact, much, much broader than this. Emotional neglect typically results from non-intentional behavior. It can be the result of maternal depression, it can be the result of mental illness, parental immaturity, or even just too many breaks in caregivers very early in life. One little boy that I saw in my practice now just a few months ago, a 4-year-old, was being kicked out of his 4th preschool for aggression. This child had already been through 19 alternative caregivers. His parents were upper middle class folks. They both traveled regularly, and they had really struggled with how to leave him from the time of early infancy and had several highly paid nannies. This child was so angry that in addition to taking my office apart in the course of that first hour, he hit, kicked, and pulled his mother's hair in my office just in the course of this short time that I was seeing them. Our ambivalence as a nation about child care, especially the lack of high-quality care for infants and toddlers, puts growing numbers of children at risk for emotional neglect across class and ethnic lines. There's been a lot of information now in the news about the importance of early stimulation. Fueled by media coverage such as this and many other volumes that have been out just this year, there is now a tendency on the part of middle-class educated folks to want to build smarter babies. So we see people trying very hard to buy all kinds of flashcards and stimulation for babies. Sophisticated toys and training materials are proliferating in our culture. I understand there's a group in Japan called Prenatal University that's actually created a little horn that you can put right up against the mother's belly to pipe in essential information during pregnancy. But the most important stimulation at this time of life is what? It's emotional. It's relational. The reason this is so important becomes clear when we understand how the cortex works. Here's how this looks. Anatomically, brain development begins with the brainstem, which controls the basic and most essential functions for our bodies, like blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature. Then next to develop is the midbrain, which controls appetite and sleep. Then comes the limbic brain, which is the seat of emotion and impulse. And finally, the cortex, the outer layer of the brain, is the slowest to mature. This is where logic, planning, and cognition, the so-called executive functions, take place. Now remember that the higher parts of the brain are all use-dependent. They're completed or not by stimulation from the child's environment. As the brain develops, the higher areas of the brain gradually begin to modulate and control the more primitive lower parts of the brain. So the younger the child, the more dominant the more primitive areas. And as the higher parts of the brain develop, particularly the cortex, so does the child's ability to moderate or control his or her impulses or more primitive behaviors. According to Perry, our ability to modulate impulsive behavior, which is absolutely key to violence prevention in this country, is directly related to the ratio between the stimulation of the lower, more primitive parts of the brain and the stimulation of the moderating skills in the cortex. Essentially, any experience in early childhood which reduces the developing brain's ability to process rational information or to focus on learning, such as fetal alcohol exposure or chronic neglect, each of which take a huge toll on the cortex, or any experience which increases the lower brain functions, the fight or flight brain chemistry, such as child abuse or domestic violence, which overactivate these lower systems in the brain. Either of these conditions can help set the stage for later violence. When a baby is abused repeatedly or is exposed to regular bouts of violence by the hands that rock the cradle, the fight or flight mechanisms that we all have to ensure our survival will be highly stimulated. Because the way the brain builds itself is use-dependent, this stimulation over time builds a hypervigilant response system. In the initial response to fear, an alarm action is triggered in babies just as it is in all of us. Think of a time when you were really frightened yourselves. Initially, you get an increased heart rate, you get increased blood pressure, you get increased respiration and muscle tone, and there's a release of stored sugar in your brain. The baby becomes hyper alert to the threat so that all information not relevant to the threat gets tuned out. Then if the threat materializes, the full range of stress systems come into play. Norepinephrine is released and all regions of the brain that regulate arousal are turned on, following even one intense incident of extreme fear. The systems involved in stress modulation will be reactivated by reminders or thoughts of the event, including dreams. So if it occurs often enough, the hypervigilant response may generalize to even subtle reminders of the event, so that a child who's been traumatized by gunshots will jump even at any loud noise. These are the kids who can't sit still in school because they're monitoring the environment for signs of danger rather than sitting calmly focused on the teacher's lesson. They will often perceive even relatively benign behaviors as hostile, and they're ready to respond. Or they're the kids who seem not to listen, who don't do what's asked because they simply aren't there. Teacher talk doesn't penetrate these little brains. They've tuned out and gone away. The fight or flight chemistry can become permanently set on high. These babies become always on red alert for signs of impending threat. Fight or flight systems, which are being constantly overstimulated, pull attention from other areas of learning. These children's brains are simply not available to focus. When chemical states of fear persist over time, this state of hypervigilance, what begins as a state, can become a trait in these children. They may look hyperactive. They may be labeled learning disabled. They show increased pulse rates, increased muscle tones, increased temperatures, increased startle responses, and if you talk to the people who are with them at night, you'll hear a lot about sleep disturbances. When these babies are boys, they tend to become aggressive, impulsive, and reactive. They're often violent with little external provocation. When they're girls, these are the children who tend to become disassociative. They tune out, they go away. Originally adaptive and protective in that threatening environment, these defenses become a huge handicap in a non-threatening environment. IQ, school performance, social relationships are all affected. We used to hear 10 years ago from teachers that there are one or two of these kids in the average classroom. Now we hear about 5 or 6 in the average classroom. Experience actually shapes brain tissue, brain chemistry, and organization. When the environment is abnormal emotionally or is deprived of adequate stimulation, the baby brain adapts accordingly. So let's come back now to Jonesboro, Arkansas, or Springfield, Oregon. At this point, we still know very little about these children. There was one article in Time magazine that talked about neglect in the life of one of the Arkansas boys, but we really don't know very much about early childhood for any of these kids. So another way to discern the roots of violence is to ask ourselves what we know about children or adults who don't kill. All of us experience rage and fear and jealousy. Everyone in this room has felt like they'd like to clobber somebody at some time or another. So I want you to ask yourself for just a minute, what keeps you from killing? Why haven't you killed? I've asked a lot of people this question since January. It's a great way to turn the tables on a reporter. And what I've found is that most people's answers fall into one of 3 categories. They describe the availability within themselves of one of 3 capacities. The first of these is empathy. It would hurt you to see somebody else hurt. You might feel like you'd like to clobber them, but the real idea of seeing them bloodied or battered in front of you, especially by your hand, would make you sick. It would give you psychological pain to do this. That feeling of internal discomfort wasn't always there. That began, that sense of your own discomfort at the thought of someone else's suffering began inside of a connection between you and someone else a long time ago. It began when someone, and it may not have been a parent for you, but someone was there to respond to your cries and needs, looked you in the eye, talked to you, gave you a sense of connection to another person in a positive way. Empathy is a cortically based capacity, again, built in the orbitofrontal area of the brain. an area that's particularly responsive to facial expressions and tones of voice, and which connects incoming sensual data, touch, sound, vision, and so on, with internal bodily states. The responsiveness of the caregiver, the sensitivity to the baby's intended message, the warmth, the timing of the adult's response to the child, the availability of eye contact, soothing sounds and gestures, all form the basis for empathy early in human life. Now, it's not completed here. This is simply the foundation. A second reason you probably have never killed someone is that you know how to bring yourself down from that excited place. You may get very upset, but you know how to get back to a normal, quiet, alert state. You know how to self-control strong negative emotions. We may do it poorly sometimes, but we know essentially how to arrive at a more rational, quieter state. This, again, wasn't always something you knew how to do. When you were frightened very young, when you were very little, say you were a baby laying in a crib and the cat jumped in the crib and frightened you. Someone was there to pick you up, put you over the shoulder. There were pats and reassurances. There, it's all right, we're going to make it, we're going to make it, until you came down from that excited place, that terrified place, to a calmer place. Over the course of time, when babies are handled sensitively, the baby, then child, learns how to internalize this, learns how to do it for oneself. The third protective ability, which has its roots in gestation, babyhood, toddlerhood, is the ability to problem solve, to think before you act. A lot of people will say, well, I haven't ever killed anyone because I know the 10 Commandments. Or I haven't ever killed anyone because I know I'd get in trouble. To figure out a constructive solution that won't get you into trouble, to analyze what's really going on for other people, to apply the 10 Commandments in future situations, all are predicated on having an intact cortical brain. Now, these can be very difficult capacities to come by if you're a fetal alcohol child or if you're a child whose brain chemistry is stuck on fight or flight. All three of these protective capacities are sown inside of a relationship with a loving caregiver early in life. Again, we're not saying the story ends here. The brain continues to develop throughout life, but never as formatively as in the first 33 months. We're not saying we should give up on anyone, on adults, children who have been abused or deprived or traumatized. We're not saying either that there's only one time of life accountable for all types of violence. We know there are exceptions to what I'm telling you. There are exceptions. There are criminals who commit violent acts because of later occurring head injury or because of a drug or alcohol cocktail or because of later occurring sexual abuse or even genetic mental illness. But what we are saying is that increasing numbers of babies in this country are growing up in conditions perfectly designed to build rage and despair and to neglect the building of the three capacities that I just talked about. This is, by the way, not just an underclass issue. Poverty is a major risk factor for some types of violence, but to hang violent behavior on poverty is to denigrate the great majority of people who rise above these circumstances every day. Furthermore, I think if we continue to try to attribute violence to poverty, we make it very easy for the majority of voters to distance this problem from themselves. While it may not result in the same rate of incarceration in the upper and middle classes, violent behavior, in fact, permeates every class in a variety of forms, including suicide, domestic violence, the use of guns, polysubstance abuse, and simply cold indifference to other human beings. If you need an example of that, think about the Central Park killers, the kids who were killing each other in Central Park, dubbed the rich brats, or the young woman who went to the prom with her boyfriend and gave birth to her newborn at the prom and got him to dump the baby in the dumpster. Kipling Kinkle. These are hardly children of poverty. So where do we go? What can we do about this? I obviously believe that a crucial first step is education of the American public. Only, I believe, when a critical mass of us get this issue, will politicians carry these concerns into programs and policies that will make a difference. Ghosts from the Nursery is about putting the face of the baby on this issue of violence. Currently, when most people think of violence, we think of adolescents, we think of adults. We don't typically think of babies. The result is that we don't stem the problem. The second step, I think, is to build on what we know works. There are programs and policies out here in Oregon. They're each in embryonic forms. They're each fighting for their lives. I could give you a list of 5 or 6 of these that would be boring to you, and I'm not going to do that, but I am going to tell you about 2 on which I'd put my money. One is home health visitation. The other is high-quality, developmentally sound child care. Home visitation provides for each mother of a newborn a trained nurse or a trained paraprofessional to visit the home to offer support and information to mothers or parents of newborns. First visits can be either prenatal or they can be just after birth. Ideally, all moms in these programs get at least 1 follow-up visit, but for those at greatest risk due to some of the factors I've mentioned earlier, like adolescent parenthood or lack of emotional support or depression, regular weekly visits can happen by these trained visitors up to 5 years or until that child enters Head Start or another system. All of us are vulnerable when we give birth. Used to be in England, if you were Princess Di or if you were the chambermaid, if you gave birth, you got a home health visitor. This is an opportunity to mentor. It's an opportunity to monitor. If the baby is already biologically vulnerable, help can be given. These children can be referred right away. If there are risk factors, referrals can be made before a little brain is shaped or patterned by negative circumstances. In Oregon, 5 years ago, the Children's Care Team legislation set up home visitation in 15 of our counties. In Oregon, 15 out of 36. The plan was that this network would increase the next biennium to all firstborn children, called Healthy Start. The plan was that all 36 counties, all firstborn children in all 36 counties in our state would get this service. Currently, the same 15 programs are struggling to serve barely 41% of the firstborn children in those original 15 counties. There have been no expansions in a political climate which focuses more closely on preserving salmon than on preserving Oregon's pool of healthy children. In Oregon, we have yet to make the connection between early childhood programs like Healthy Start and juvenile crime prevention, in spite of the fact that this connection is definitely being made nationally. I have been meeting with Janet Reno and her staff. There is a very clear focus on early childhood, and upcoming expenditures will reflect that interest. Child care is another huge opportunity. A recent Children's Defense Fund report reveals the fact that, and this is a 5-university study across this country, less than 8.5% of the care for infants and toddlers in this country was found to be high-quality, developmentally appropriate care. Now, that's a very scary figure when you think about the number of children in child care in this country. Many states, such as ours, are battling to even provide the adequate monitoring of child care homes for basic health and safety, let alone any enrichment in terms of adequate emotional nurturing or adequate stimulation. Head Start is struggling to reach 50% of the eligible children in this state. If we really want to change the violence continuum, a major key is to provide high quality and consistent nurturing for every single baby and toddler by someone who is equipped to be and who wants to be with that baby. If a parent wants to be and can afford to be at home, then subsidizing this kind of care may be a great investment, though very ignorant or damaged parents may require skills and training and other supports to do the job well. There is not one answer for all families. We need an adequate menu for everyone parenting these very young citizens. In my opinion, the entire child care industry needs to undergo major reform, and here's what I think should happen. 150 years ago in this nation, we were only beginning to understand that government should invest in the free public education of children ages 6 to 18. Now in this country, we're in trouble. Our public education system is clearly faltering. But we take public schools for granted. Too many children, however, are entering public schools unable to learn because of the kind of brain-based differences that I talked to you about earlier. Based on the new research on the brain, I really believe that education in this country needs to be redefined as beginning at 0 and reconfigured accordingly. This kind of reconfiguration would clearly not be primarily an institutionally based system. It would begin with home visitation, mentoring, and support, especially for high-risk families. Gradually, new parents can be brought into training groups, and toddlers can be brought into enriched educational opportunities in a group setting for learning. We have the beginnings of this with Early Head Start in this state. We would have to be careful, given the absences, particularly the lack of focus on emotional needs inside of our existing education system. We'd have to keep the focus on emotional and relational learning. But this may be a path toward a more preventive and non-stigmatizing safety net around our babies. Those of us working in all these disparate areas, social services and juvenile corrections, health, education, and mental health, need to move outside the boxes and create a supportive, nurturing, and stimulating opportunity to reduce the number of children requiring remedial services. Just imagine how much we could cut down on early child neglect and child abuse or serious emotional disturbances or learning disabilities if every single baby born received adequate early nurturing, early stimulation, and assessment from the beginning of life. Several nations are preceding us on this path, including the Scandinavian countries and France. We really do know what to do. We really do know what to do. But there's a big gap between what we're doing and what we know. And of course, the inevitable question is, how are we going to pay for this? The answer to this question is a variable. It varies from state to state. But the bottom line is that nothing, absolutely nothing, could be more expensive than what we're currently doing. Incarceration in a medium to high security prison in this country for 1 year costs between $20,000 and $100,000, not counting collateral costs, such as crime investigation, prosecution costs, cost to victims and their families. Also not counted in that figure are the years, in many cases, of special ed, family services, and multiple interventions that led up to the jail cell. Compared to this, home visitation at an average cost of $3,000 to $5,000 per year for a maximum of 3 years per high-risk child seems like a bargain. There's no question that these programs reduce crime. If any of you are interested in data, there is brand new data. Many of you are aware of the RAND report. There was another recent study done of the Perry Preschool program, which was the program upon which Head Start was based, looking at crime reduction, and they found the reduction in between the control group and the group that got the intervention to be in the 80-some%. So they reduced crime by 80-something% in matched evaluations. Riveting new data is now available just this month in the Journal of the American Medical Association on nurse home visitation and its direct effect on crime after a 15-year follow-up. In closing, I want to remind you that while preventing violence is an important goal to achieve by investing in our children from the beginning, it's not the only thing we'll accomplish by investing in our babies. Violence is only the most visible and the hardest to ignore symptom of something much deeper that's amiss in our communities, a sense of connecting, a loss in civility, a loss in relating. In 1962, Rachel Carson published her classic book, The Silent Spring, which brought before all of us the image of a spring without songbirds. Carson showed an unseen threat to the entire food chain, the entire chain of life, from pesticides introduced at the front end of the ecosystem. A spring without songbirds was a terrifying image, and in contemplating that prospect, we began to consider the intricate linkages that exist between the front end and the outcome, at least as it applied to the ecosystem. Now, more than 35 years later, however, we have yet to understand that a parallel dynamic is at work in the human system. Toxic experiences, family violence, abuse, and chronic neglect, along with toxic substances such as nicotine, alcohol, and illegal drugs, are being absorbed by our babies in record numbers. As a result of the cumulative degradation to the human community at the beginning of life, we face a threat to our community at least as lethal as the effect of DDT. The quality of the human community is directly tied to each of our abilities to love, to empathize with other people, to regulate our emotions, and to engage in complex thinking. By failing to understand the cumulative effects of the poisons assaulting our babies in the forms of abuse, neglect, and toxic substances, we are participating in our own destruction. If Rachel Carson's image of a spring without songbirds produced enough concern in the 60s to reduce the poisoning of the natural environment, then perhaps there's hope now in the 90s and beyond for preventing the poisoning of the cradle of human community. Your task, our task, while huge, is fundamental, I believe, to every other issue we face as a species. It's the sweetness and the vulnerability, the curiosity and the playfulness, the hopefulness and the innocence, the trust and the arms outreached purely to embrace or to help that is at stake in our times. We're facing not only the possibility of a spring without songbirds, but a future without people who care or notice the difference. Thank you.
I think what we'll do is we'll take Lloyd's first question, and then we'll adjourn the meeting at 1:15. But for those of you who have questions, please ask them at the mic. Many of us will have to leave at 1:15, but we'll continue with some questions from the floor after that for those of you who would like to stay. Lloyd, you have a question?
You, in one of your remarks, said don't give up on anyone. And of course, you've got a spectrum of people, young people from age 0 to 18 that are in one way or in the system or another that are having problems. And if we're dealing with resources, which is, I think, a key thing here, where do you start spending your money in that whole spectrum of things? What's your priority on what to do?
Lloyd's right. There's a whole continuum of children out there who need help, and I work with some of them, and maybe many of you in this room work with some of them. The problem is we don't have a safety net at the beginning. We really are a nation of idiots about infancy. We don't get that little brain is, I mean, how many of you have very young children or have been around very little babies recently? It's amazing who's there by 2 or 3 or 4 months of age, who's present behind those eyes. We have no safety net in our system of social services for very young children. We often will go out, you know, in child welfare, we'll go out on an older child on a complaint. We often just overlook a baby. We really don't think that babies are doing much. I would put my money on the front end, and I put it on the 2 programs I mentioned, on home health visitation and on high quality, developmentally appropriate child care, on a safety net at the beginning of life. I think we could greatly reduce, not eliminate, but greatly reduce crime in this country and the number of children needing services all along that continuum if we started there.
Corleen Craft, City Club member. Would be interested in having you amplify on if we don't give up in the developmental stages, if the brain has not developed the synapses that they require and they've gone away, what about that?
Well, it depends on when you begin and what is being threatened. There's, you know, your question's really a broad one. If you're talking about intellectual stimulation, often there's more hope. It depends on the age of the child. It depends on the specific losses. I had a child that I talked about in the book who was brought to me at the age of 3 months. He had been screaming, and clearly this mother was just crawling out of her skin, was terrified. She'd been to 3 pediatricians, 2 of whom had strongly recommended sedatives for her. I saw the baby, I saw her, I'd known the mother.